Mr. Douglas was born in Maryland in 1818. This year we're celebrating his 200th birthday. I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, on about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. That's how Mr. Douglas began his first autobiography. He talked about having seen his mother 4, maybe 5 times. He said he would always see her at night. He says that by the time a slave child was no older than 12 months old, that child would be separated from his mother. She lived on an adjacent plantation about 12 miles away. He said he remembered her cuddling him and putting him to sleep. He says, but by morning time, she would be long gone. When she fell ill, he was not allowed to go and visit her, and he did not find out until after the event that his mother had passed. It's from the state of Maryland, from which Mr. Douglas would escape in 1838 at the age of 20. As a matter of fact, a few weekends ago, we just celebrated the 180th anniversary of his escape. And although Maryland was a border state in the American Civil War, which meant that it stayed in the Union, which allowed it to maintain its institution of slavery. We'll make that connection once we get in the house. Up the sidewalk, over that bridge in the distance, in a few hundred miles, you'll come to Rochester, New York. After Mr. Douglas obtained his freedom, he lived the majority of his adult life in Rochester, New York. Raised his family there, educated his children there, started his newspaper, the North Star, which was an abolitionist newspaper. And we know that abolitionists were individuals who were trying to get rid of the institution of slavery in the United States. He was discovered by an abolitionist by the name of William Lloyd Garrison. Mr. Garrison was very instrumental in putting him on the public speaking circuit. They would have a falling out in 1847. We'll talk about that when we get in the house. Now, although Mr. Douglas was a free man, his liberty was still in jeopardy. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a system by which they were able to get enslaved individuals out of the South into the North, and in some instances into Canada, Rochester being one of those last stops. If he got caught harboring fugitives, especially after 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, justice would come down very hard on Mr. Douglas. And if you look through the trees to your left, you'll see downtown Washington. By the time Mr. Douglas arrived here on a permanent basis in 1872, he had made a name for himself. He would be an advisor to presidents. He would hold high-ranking government positions. He would be a bank president, chief editor of a newspaper, and from 1871 to 1895, he would be on the board of trustees at Howard University. On top of that table, you put your calling card on that tray. The calling card is just merely a business card, modern day business card. This announces who you are. You notice these 2 lithographs. This one here is of John Brown. John Brown is at the top. Now, he's an abolitionist, but I like to call him a radical abolitionist. He believed the only way to get rid of the institution of slavery in the United States was going to be through violent means. He and his sons hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death with broadswords in Kansas. This is in the 1850s when Kansas was earning its nickname, Bleeding Kansas. As a matter of fact, there was a civil war in Kansas. I like to call it the dress rehearsal before the big one. It was going to roll around in 1861. 1859, he met with Mr. Douglas. He had a plan of going to Harper's Ferry. There was an arsenal there. He wanted to pretty much confiscate those rifles, build an army that was going to march through the South and eradicate slavery by force. Now, for 2 days, both men were together, one trying to convince the other's point of view. Douglas didn't go with Brown. Brown went to Harper's Ferry. His plan pretty much fell apart from the very beginning. He was captured, tried, and convicted of treason. On the morning of his execution, December of 1859, he wrote a note, handed that note to his jailer, and this is what it said. I, John Brown, am quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will only be purged by blood. Well, that was one prophetic statement. The American Civil War produced over 50,000 civilian deaths, military personnel over 750,000, total killed and wounded 1.9 million. All of our wars combined leading up to the American Civil War didn't equal those numbers, and all of our wars after combined, at least as of today, don't equal those numbers. This was our cataclysmic event in our history. This lithograph here is what we call the storming of Fort Wagner. In 1989, there was a movie entitled Glory. It was about African Americans who fought in the 54th Massachusetts during the United States Civil War, American Civil War. Now, we're taught in school that the Emancipation Proclamation freed individuals who were enslaved, when in fact it did not, nor had the power to free a single individual. If you were enslaved in the border states, and we mentioned Maryland as being one, but that's also Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, by 1863, West Virginia, or anywhere where the Union was already in control, New Orleans, certain parts of the Hampton Roads area, January 1st, 1863, you would still be enslaved. This document only affected those individuals and states that were in rebellion to the Union. So what would have happened if by December 31st, 1862, those Confederate states had come back to the Union? They would have still had their peculiar institution of slavery. And this Emancipation Proclamation, as critical as we see it today, at that point in time, it was merely a worthless, unenforceable document short of a Union victory on the battlefield. So if they don't win this war, that document will mean absolutely nothing. But there was one small clause in Mr. Lincoln's January 1st version, simply said this: any man of color who wants to fight for the Union Army or the Union Navy will be allowed to do so. Now wait a minute, blacks have been defending this country since the Revolutionary War. But now for the first time in U.S. military history, they were able to defend the country legally. Over 209,000 men of color, 38,000 of them died in the process. Says, you know what? We'll put our bodies on the line for this unenforceable document. We'll join the Army, we'll join the Navy. And they were willing to defend this country when this country was not so willing to defend them. Now here's the tie between these guys and Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas was very instrumental in recruiting troops for both the 54th and 55th Massachusetts. Amongst the first 23 individuals he recruited, 2 of them were his own sons. And I'll introduce you to them when we get upstairs. Douglas's library, one of the first things you'll notice are his books. He had just under 3,000 books in his library. Now that's astounding considering the fact that when he was born and where he was born, it was illegal for him to learn to read. His grandmother used to tell him how special he was, and he chose to listen to that voice because there were other voices of the period that could have defined him. But his master's wife saw how special he was, and she began to teach him how to read. Then she had a fight with her husband. He says to her, you cannot teach him to read, because if he ever learns to read, he will no longer be fit to be a slave. If he learns to read, he's going to disqualify himself as a slave. And so she stopped teaching him. And here's what Douglas said he did. He said he'd make friends with all the white children he could. He'd keep food in his pockets, and he'd offer them food to teach him how to read. That's why he's got so many omnibus. And let me just say, Douglas ain't 20, 30, 40 years old. He comes to that realization he's 10 years old. And I normally ask adults, how many of you know 10-year-olds go to their parents, mom, dad, I need a job to earn money to hire a tutor to help me in the 5th grade. You don't see that. He understood the correlation between reading and being able to educate himself. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's on the wall. She's part of the women's suffrage movement. Douglas will align himself with that, and I'll introduce you to another woman upstairs. A picture of Mr. Lincoln. Douglas met with him face to face on 3 occasions, and he would be an advisor from President Lincoln to Benjamin Harrison. Now the books, the hats, the envelopes, the pens, the glasses, the letters on the desk, canes in the corner, all belong to Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas wrote his 3rd autobiography on that desk in 1881. Why did he write his first autobiography? Because he's on the public speaking circuit, and folk are like, this guy's way too articulate to have been a slave. You better come up with a better scam than this. So he writes his book, and by doing so, he reached an audience outside of the lecture hall. So now you don't have to go and see him. You can speak of his book. The other thing is, he ends up revealing some of the details of his life. The biggest in my mind is his real name. His name was not Douglas. He got that from the play Lady on the Lake. But his real name was Fredrick Augustus Washington Bailey. 5,000 copies in this first printing. Amongst those to read it is Thomas Alls, former slave owner. And by law, all could go after him. So Douglas is in Europe. He's over there for 18 months. He's lecturing, selling his book, also raising money for his purchase. They start negotiating and end up settling on a price December of 1846. And in 1847, spring to be exact, Douglas came back to the United States, submitted his papers, and became a free man. This is the West Parlor. This is where the family would spend much of its time. They talk about current events, neighborhood gossip, entertain each other. Music was very big in this family. Mr. Douglas taught himself how to play violin. He had 5 children. His youngest, Miss Annie, died at around age 11. Between his 4 adult children, 3 of them gave him 21 grandchildren. He would give them piggyback rides on this floor. They would braid and put ribbons in his hair. His oldest daughter, Miss Rosetta, as well as his second wife, Miss Helen, both played piano on that piano. And Mr. Douglas taught himself, one of his grandchildren Joseph Douglas went on to become an accomplished professional violinist. That violin that you see on top of the piano right there was given to the estate by his wife, Joseph Douglas's wife. So that's how we were able to get it. And that portrait over top of the fireplace is a scene from Shakespeare's Othello. Mr. Douglas was an avid Shakespearean reader. He also loved Charles Dickens, who wrote The Christmas Carol. But the parallelism for him is Othello, as you can see on the left, is a black man who rises to the rank of general and falls in love with the Duke's daughter, Desdemona. So the parallelism for Douglas, a black man rises to the top of his profession, falling in love with someone from another neighborhood. Blue and gold is English, bottom green and white is Louisiana, and you've got influences from Italy, Mediterranean, and the blue and white over here is Chinese. 14 rooms in this house. And I don't care if you give me I don't care. 1877, 14 rooms. 1879, he began to expand this room. He would expand it to 21 rooms in total in the house. You've got a coffee grind on top of a pie cupboard. You can bake your goods, put them in there to cool. It would also keep insects and rodents out of their food. This box that you see here, this is the precursor to the refrigerator. This is an ice box. You use those tongs and put a 25-pound block of ice in the top, and you'll put all your perishables down the side. Flour tin to keep your flour fresh, and thanks to the advent of the railroad, grocery stores are sprouting up everywhere, probably one in your neighborhood. Cornstarch, 2 bottles of wine. Mr. Douglas was not an alcohol drinker. He had very strong reasons as to why he did not drink, but he did have wine on the premises. He said, here's what Mr. Douglas said. He says in his book that between the holidays of Christmas and New Year's, slave owners would allow their folk to do whatever they want, including go on these drinking binges. He says, but we were too busy trying to find the will of God. We did not want alcohol to impair our minds. So he's teaching these other folk how to read, but he's teaching them from the Bible. So not only teaching them to read, he's also teaching them the Bible. Another thing about Douglas that we don't talk much about, he was an ordained minister. Now, he drank coffee, tea, lemonade, hot cocoa was one of his favorites. Vegetable gardens, and he did cancel mill foods, and of course this is an ice cream maker. Now this room is what we call a catch-all. It's just for storage. There were 2 cisterns on the premises. A cistern just simply caught rainwater. That water is excellent for utility, but not for drinking. You can pump that water up here, heat it up on your stove. This is your wash tub on the left, rinse tub on the right. Then you put your clothes out on the line to dry. After they dried, you put you fire your stove up again, and you put multiple irons on the stove. The heavier ones were for coats and trousers. The lighter ones were for shirts and linens. And you would alternate back and forth between hot irons. Miss Anna took great pride in taking care of Mr. Douglas's clothes. She did not travel on the road with him quite often, but she realized that when he was abroad on the road, he'd be speaking in front of hundreds and thousands of people, and that was her contribution to what he was doing. This room over here is Haley Jordan's room. He's the youngest grandchild. And interviewed towards the end of his life, he said that when he was here at his grandparents' house, that's the room he wanted. 3 pieces of standard operating equipment, that's what I call it. Water pitcher and wash basin on top of the chest of drawers. And that bowl that you see on the floor, well, that is your chamber pot. That's how you're going to the bathroom at 2 a.m. You've got an outhouse, but you may not go out there in inclement weather or late at night. This room is what we call the trunk room. 3 of Mr. Douglas's trunks are here. The one on the right has his name on the side, F. Douglas. You will notice that 2 of those trunks are domed. What does it mean to have a domed trunk? Well, that's a sign of status. You can't stack anything on top of a domed trunk. This house was built in late 1850s by a man named John Van Hook. 1873, there was a housing crash. 1877, this house ends up in foreclosure. And that's how Mr. Douglas got it. Now that room right there is what we call the men's guest bedroom. So all of the male guests would be assigned to that room. During the Victorian era, everybody pretty much had their own room. If you could afford it, you would. And this is the women's guest bed chamber. So your female guests would be sent to this room. The furniture in this room, unlike the furniture in the other house, which was already here, this was acquired by Douglas family members, including the portrait over the top of the fireplace of Miss Susan B. Anthony. And she ends up being another founder of the women's suffrage movement. They start in 1840. Mr. Douglas starts to support them shortly after. And why does Douglas start to support a women's group if he's not a woman? Here's what he says later on in his life: I will unite with anyone to do what's right, and with no one to do what's wrong. This is Miss Anna's room. Two gentlemen on the wall I told you I was going to introduce you to. One on the left is Lewis Douglas. The one on the right is Charles Douglas. Those are two sons that Mr. Douglas recruited who fought with the 54th Massachusetts. Charles, the one on the right, ends up in Massachusetts Colored Cavalry. But Lewis is there in that climactic battle. It was climactic in movie at the end. But that storming of Fort Wagner, he was there. Both of them ended up surviving. He got severely wounded though. And he's the only son that didn't have children. So you can imagine what kind of wound he had. He ended up getting an infection down there too. And Miss Anna lived here for 4 years. She was, she suffered from rheumatoid arthritis. So it was very painful for her. She had a stroke, and they had to hire a nurse to help take care of her. That chair that you see in the corner, that is an invalid chair. It's a modern day wheelchair. And they wheeled her out here and put her in the window so she could get sun and scenery. When she ended up having another stroke. And when she died in that room. Now here's another Victorian era tradition. If you could afford to do that, you would leave the person's personal effects in there, just there, and no one else would ever use that room again. And it would serve as a shrine to the person who lived there. And that's pretty much what Mr. Douglas did for Miss Anna. Now this is Miss Helen's room. She's got 2 pieces of modern technology in there. She's got a typewriter. She's the writer of her own feminist newspaper. And she also has a sewing machine. She's a seamstress. That sewing machine is made by Singer, which still makes sewing machines today. Now she's very instrumental in this story because she's the one who wants this to become a museum for Mr. Douglas. She outlives Mr. Douglas 8 years. She died in 1903. But by the time she died, she had put in place an organization that would, number 1, run this as a museum, and number 2, would raise money to purchase this from the children. And that organization ran this until 1962, at which time President John F. Kennedy signed legislation bringing this under the auspices of the National Park Service. So that's how we got it, and that's how we can maintain 70% of the artifacts, because those artifacts never left the house. Now there were fireplaces in all of these rooms. 3 were taken out for the modern day HVAC system, but that's how you keep this place warm in the wintertime. How do you keep it cool in the summertime? Well, you just simply open up the windows and the doors. You get incredible air current going through the house, and that's how you keep it cool. Up those stairs through that door. There's an attic upstairs, 4 more rooms, bringing us to 21 rooms. Goodness. Last but not least, Mr. Douglas's room. Now his room is somewhat modest, considering he's making $52,000 a year. Now, how's he making his money? Certainly his jobs, yes, but also, what else is he doing? Oh my goodness. Public speaking, book royalties, and real estate holdings. Turns out he owned 4 properties here in Washington, D.C. 2 properties in Rochester, New York, that's 6. Block of houses in Baltimore. Average is 8, let's just say 4, that's 10. He had a summer home in Twin Oaks, and at the time he died, they were building another house for him on the shore of the Chesapeake. So that's 12 houses. He used 12 to 16 houses.
Those are original shoes. Everything's original.
Yes, those dumbbells that you see, his grandchildren said that towards the end of his life,
he would be out every morning, front yard lifting weights. That's his vest in the chair.
Wow.